lecture series, also on global perspectives on the environment. I'll just announce before I introduce our introducer that on Monday we actually have a talk not in our series, and this is Andrew Piper, who's sort of in a series that the Institute was doing with digital technologies. And I thought we'd leave the door open just for coolness, if you don't mind, okay? Okay, thank you, because it's so hot, we can't control the heat in here, I'm afraid, everybody, so we've got the doors open as long as we can. He's going to talk on rifling through books, which seems to be in the same room here at 4 p.m. on Monday. We actually have such a packed week that we're all going to be exhausted, but it's wonderful. It's a rich week. Tuesday and Wednesday, we have Kathleen Malabou here. She's a Provosto lecturer, and it's co-sponsored with Kat, and she's going to talk from sorrow to indifference, and that's at 4 p.m. also in this room. This room is going to get a lot of use. And finally, she does have a seminar on the Wednesday morning where she's going to talk about what is a psychic event, developing some of her work on theorizing the brain and psychoanalysis. But you have to talk to Robert Harvey if you would like to go to that seminar, because it is sort of it's a limited number of seats for that. And finally, on Thursday, a week from today, Paul Monod will talk on the occult revival in late 18th century England. And that's a wonderful series that Kathleen Wilson has been putting together called Journeys Through the Enlightenment. So we have these flyers available, and do pick them up. But now it's really my pleasure to introduce Michael Rubenstein. Michael worked very hard with me on arranging this whole series. We put in for a grant together, and I'm just delighted that we won it, and he's been a wonderful support, or partner, sorry, not support, partner with this. He's going to introduce our speaker. I just wanted to mention his wonderful book, Public Works, about infrastructure and the development of Irish modernism. He's now working on a new book, which also sounds that it's going to be just wonderful. And he's going to introduce our speaker today. So Michael, thank you so much.
Thanks, Anne. I also want to thank Anne Barrios and Olivia Manis for helping us to arrange everything today. And I want to welcome you all to tonight's lecture. This is part of, it's hard for me to even understand sometimes, but it's part of 2 different lecture series, I think. And this strand of which is called Humanities in the Environment, Politics, Science, and Ecologies of Value. And in that vein, we probably ought to also to thank the Dean Nancy Squires for supporting the Dean's Lecture Series, of which this whole environmental series is sort of folded in, and also Provost Dennis Asanis for support for the Humanities for the Environment initiative that we're also involved with here at the Humanities Center. So this whole environmentalist speaker series is being supported partly by a FAST grant, that is the Faculty of Arts, Humanities, and Social Sciences Interdisciplinary Initiatives Fund, and also in part by the Mellon Consortium of Humanities Centers and Institutes Initiative, as part of one of their special projects called Humanities for the Environment. This series has a very illustrious list of speakers who are passing through Stony Brook this year. People who have already visited include Joni Adamson, Nicholas Fisher, David Chalmides, Michael Jalobter, and these are things that have already happened. But after Lee's talk today, we have Ramachandra Gua on October 30th, Sandra Steingraber on November 7th, Suzanne Moser on November 14th, and Elizabeth Colbert. Colbert?
I don't know, actually. I'm waiting for somebody to illuminate.
Stephen from I think it's Colbert. And she's going to be here on November 21st. And we already have even more spillover from the series into the fall of next year, where we're expecting visits from Dipesh Chakrabarty, Rob Nixon, and Ursula Heise as part of a continuation of the series. So there's a lot going on with this initiative. Today, though, it's my pleasure to introduce Leerom Medovi. Lee has recently left a post at Portland State University to take chairing the English department at the University of Arizona in Tucson. He's author of, this is a first book? Rebels? The Rebels book?
Yep.
His first book is called Rebels, Youth and the Cold War Origins of Identity. It was published in 2005. And I found Lauren Berland's review of it on Amazon, where she says, Rebels is a great book about bad boys and girls, melodrama and rock and roll, and the emergence of identity as a site of social concern and capitalist fantasy. Now, in some ways, it may not seem particularly related to the environmental work that he's been doing in the intervening years that I'll talk about today, but I think in my mind, it's connected, and I'll come back to that in a second. He is also the founding director of the Portland Center for Public Humanities while he was at Portland State University. He's and the recipient of a collaborative Miller Grant on Understanding Sustainability, Perspectives from the Humanities. And he's currently the principal investigator on a multi-institutional Mellon Consortium of Humanities Centers and Institutes grant on what's called Religion. The title is Religion, Secularism, and Political Belonging. So I was first made aware of Lee's work on environmentalism when I first read the Biopolitical Unconscious, which some of you already have seen or read through the center, which really sort of blew my mind in the way that it exploded so many myths and common sense truisms about the nature of environmentalist thought. In fact, there's what I think is a really wonderful critical instinct here. That thrives on what I see, or what I would call sort of productive contrarianism. The Biopolitical Unconscious is, after all, an environmentalist essay, essentially, whose final line challenges the whole conceptual framework of environmentalism. For those of you who read it, this will be familiar. For those not, I hope there's still a shock value to it when I read it out. He says, the political goal of a properly Marxist eco-criticism will not be to save the environment, will be to abolish it. Now, what this means is the subject of that essay, and the words themselves echo lines from Marx's Communist Manifesto, Marx and Engels' Communist Manifesto. But I think it's perversely pleasing in a way to be able to welcome Lee here to speak at a conference called Humanities for the Environment, when the last line says he actually advocates the abolishing of the environment in the first place. And I don't think that it's only contrarianism, but rather a commitment to intellectual rigor and a willingness to question our deepest held kinds of common sense that makes this work on environmentalism so compellingly readable and so important in my view. And if I was going to try to characterize his brand of environmentalist thought, which I think is actually quite unique, I suppose you could do worse than just look at the title of that essay, The Biopolitical Unconscious, to get the sense of the sort of Marxist critical theory background and the Foucauldian sort of critique of biopolitics and biopower that inform the way that he's approaching the topic. And it seems to me today that we're going to get Derrida thrown into the mix as well, in what are likely to be very interesting ways. So I did mention earlier that Medovi received a Miller Grant for something called Understanding Sustainability, and another one of his essays, which was made available through the Humanities Institute, which was called A Contribution to the Critique of Political Ecology, Sustainability as Disavowal, argues that the whole notion of sustainability as it is currently formulated is little more than a neoliberal fig leaf for the continuation of business as usual. So via Marxist political economy, he demonstrates completely convincingly, in my view anyway, that sustainability as a corporate discourse, or as a popular discourse, in any case, is entirely bankrupt. And by that I don't mean partially bankrupt or subject to corruption or something like that, but simply logically and definitionally bankrupt according to the strict definition of the capitalist corporation. And that's what I think is such a contribution from the work. But basically, I just want to point out once again an inherent contradiction that as a receiver of a grant called Understanding Sustainability, and then writing an essay arguing that sustainability as such is in fact unsustainable. There's a certain, shall we say, rebellious relationship to the institutions that are supporting the work in a way that's sort of wonderfully contrarian, wonderfully counterintuitive. And I think I'm hoping that we'll get some more another example of that today. But there's definitely a pattern, and I'm actually sort of afraid to even ask what Lee is going to do with the CHCI grant for religion, secularism, and political belonging. Although I don't think that those terms are going to remain inert after he's done with them. In any case, the critical reasoning is quite often, I find, at least in these two essays about environmentalism, impeccable, relentless, and often terrifying, and also necessary and refreshing in going against the grain of so much of the mainstream discourse of environmentalism and sustainability. So I'm really excited about this talk, which is called Remediation, Pharmikons, and the Politics of Environmental Health. Please join me in welcoming Lee Medovi.
Thank you for that. That's an incredibly generous introduction. Thank you, Michael. Thank you, Anne, for inviting me. Thank all of you for coming. I want to thank Anne Berrios, who helped facilitate getting me here. Logistics, very important. I guess probably am giving a talk in something of the same vein. And so the title of the talk, Remediation, Pharmikons, and the Politics of Environmental Health. The focus here is on remediation, and just in case it's to sort of help kind of provide the context. I'm interested in sort of unpacking and kind of calling into question the work that goes on under the rubric environmental remediation. And you may know environmental remediation is what happens when there is a disaster that needs to be kind of cleaned up, as it were, and that could be, Fukushima, could be, oil spill, could be, could be environmental remediation, could be the addressing of the logging of, sort of part of the Pacific Northwest where I've been living for the last 13 years. I just want to unpack, the work I tend to do, I think, is trying to kind of get at the sort of discursive risks that you find in environmental discourse, and just trying to ensure, I'm trying to do police work, if you like, a certain kind, is the language that we're using actually accomplishing what we would hope it would accomplish, or is it in fact in some ways sometimes undermining what we're hoping to accomplish? So with that in mind, I wanted to share a couple of quotations with you that I'll sort of use to kick off my talk. And this one I took off a British Petroleum corporate website in the wake of the big oil spill in the Gulf of Mexico that took place several years ago. And it says, BP, British Petroleum, has been working with state and federal agencies to assess and restore natural resources injured as a result of the Deepwater Horizon accident. The goal is to return the environment to its baseline condition, the condition it would be in if the Deepwater Horizon accident had not occurred. And I'm just very, very interested in that formulation. I'll be coming back to it. And then I wanted to just hold that in relation to another passage by Ben Ikari. He's an Ogoni writer, a micro-minority writer of Nigeria, who in an interview in The Guardian on May 29, 2010 said, in response to what was taking place, if this Gulf accident had happened in Nigeria, neither the government nor the company would have paid much attention. This kind of spill happens all the time in the Delta. So I'll be trying to speak to that juxtaposition in this talk. Sorry. So let me speak a little bit to the environmental term itself, remediation, which I would suggest converges with sustainability, resilience, and greening, other terms that one finds in environmental discourse, to evoke an ethically positive resolution to ecological crisis. And just think about each of these words. Sustainability suggests environmental replenishment. Resilience offers a certain sense of revivification. And greening, a spring-like return to life. In each of these cases, the underlying theme associated with the term is a brush with death, a harrowing moment of morbidity from which one has just managed to veer away. The concept of remediation participates fully in that eco-motif, suggesting the restoration of some nearly lost vitality through the neutralization of the afflictions, right? Returning to the baseline condition after, if you like, a medical emergency. This cluster of meanings at stake in the words environmental uses derives from the Latin medere, which means to heal, but in particular to counteract a sickness. In these uses, remediation echoes the words legal and educational meanings. So environmental remediation resembles a legal remedy, a juridical intervention that's intended to alleviate a wrongful harm. And it likewise echoes remedial education, which is understood, I would suggest, at some level as a pedagogical medicine to counteract sickly student performance. That's the implication. This primary sense of remediation might seem unrelated to a rather different use of the word that you find in Jay Bolter and Richard Grusin's use of the word to describe certain paradigmatic representational strategies of new media. In their book, you may know it, is titled Remediation. And in their usage, they derive the word instead of, from medere, from the Latin medium, that which is in the middle, right? And more specifically, the semiotic technologies, or media, that stand between us and the object world. For Bolter and Grusin, remediation typically concerns a new medium's strategic mimicry of an old one that has been at least partially supplanted as a communicative intermediary. So you might think here of screen technologies mimicking of print in the form of the ebook. That's a sort of an example of what I'm talking about, what they're talking about. What I'd like to suggest is that where the environment is concerned, these two etymologies ultimately converge. Environmental remediation as medere promises to counteract a crisis of well-being, to stave off an environmental brush with death. But this eco-remedy draws potency from its status as a medium. To remediate is to present in a revised form the environment that existed prior to some kind of affliction as a means of completing the circuit of power within which the remediation is exercised. I know that's saying a lot, and I think it will become clear over the course of the talk. And let me begin by talking a little bit about remediation as a promise of remedy or medicine for the ills of environmental damage. Through its derivation from medere, environmental remediation converges in many ways with the Greek word pharmikon, the term whose complex set of connotations Derrida famously considered in his extended essay, Plato's Pharmacy. And I found the use of Derrida will be relatively light in this talk, but I think useful. What Derrida suggested in that essay is that Plato's description of writing as a pharmacon, a drug that magically draws in the reader, operates as a polysemic unity. And what I mean by that, what he means by the polysemic unity in that context, is that any singular translation of the pharmacon cannot fail to mislead, because this is a word that is simultaneously rendered in many different ways. It has kind of multiple valences, all of which are in play. So the pharmacon can refer to a remedy, it can refer to a recipe, it can refer to a poison, it can refer to a drug, or to a filter. Okay? And just as medicine acts powerfully upon the body, so in the context that Plato is writing about it, rhetoric as a pharmacon has a profound impact on the soul. That's what they're addressing in the dialogue, in the Phaedrus, where the impact of rhetoric can be either beneficial or baneful, right? There's sort of no certainty. And so as a pharmacon, what we know is that the effect will be powerful, but we don't necessarily know whether it will be a good effect or a bad effect, right? Now for Derrida, Plato's privileging of the spoken over the written relies in that dialogue upon a, quote, the simulation of the woven texture. And just to back up for a minute, in the Phaedrus, what essentially happens is that the written word is disparaged, right? The written word is poisonous. It's pharmacon in the bad sense, because you can't actually rely on its meaning in the way that you can upon the spoken word, where presence is sort of guaranteed. This is a dissimulation, Derrida says, that's founded on the basic ambiguity, insofar as what Plato is up to there is assigning only to the written word and not to the spoken word the toxicity of the pharmacon, right? In other words, both the written word and the verbal word, in fact, from Derrida's point of view, are not distinguishable in that kind of way. Both of them can mislead. Both of them have engaged in slippage, but we sort of presume through the metaphysics of presence, right, that the person is there and the spoken word can be guaranteed in its meaning by the author, that there is no slippage. What Derrida's essay seeks to do is to unravel the complex dissimulation through which Plato produces the privileging of speech. Now, in environmental remediation, if we wish to think about it as a pharmacon with a dissimulation that we also want to unravel, then the first step, I think, would be to observe the fact that it inverts Plato's emphasis on the pharmacon's negative convevalence. Assembling only the pharmacon's positive associations, environmental remediation asks to be appreciated as a helpful medicine that restores an environment back to health through the removal of toxins or contaminants. Derrida's underlying point applies, however. Environmental remediation, I would propose, is itself a dissimulating text, whose remedial promise both conceals and depends upon its constitutive other, its equal potency as an environmental poison. On May 17, 2010, one day before the corporation's annual general meeting, a, quote, visionary new remedial plan for the Niger Delta was apparently released by the press, to the press by Royal Dutch Shell. And this is, it's actually quite hard, as I'll explain later, to get a handle, to get a
Do you like a better light? So
yeah.
that
Sure, let's see, which,
Ignacio will do it, and you can see better. D.
yeah.
It's a little clearer.
You know, yeah, it's, I'll explain what's in the text, so it won't be too
prefer the
crucial.
light?
Is it better? Is it better?
Would you prefer the room lit?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah. It's okay. What this is essentially is a kind of, I produced a PDF out of the available press release. And I'll describe what's in it. But essentially, after this visionary new remedial plan is referred to as the CSR-ND plan, the Comprehensive Shell Remediation, Niger Delta. Okay. After half a century of ecological, political, social, and economic devastation in Nigeria caused by oil extraction, Shell proposed a bold plan that included not only the full cessation of offshore drilling, but also what the press described as a sweeping intention to, quote, clean up all areas of the Niger Delta where they operate, compensate local communities for past injuries, and institute a local stakeholder program that will contribute to lifting the region out of poverty, end quote. It's a passage out of a press release. In the release, Shell noted that the plan had been fast-tracked as a timely, proactive response to British Petroleum's recent Deepwater Horizon spill in the Gulf of Mexico, declaring itself, quote, proud to be the first international petrochemical company to embark on a rehabilitation and compensation program of any significant scale. The massive amount of oil spilled every single year in the Niger Delta is in fact estimated at nearly twice the amount that was ultimately spilled altogether in the BP accident. It's a kind of amazing fact. Yet never before had Shell felt any compulsion to mitigate the damage. So the announcement of the comprehensive Shell remediation plan for the Niger Delta was in fact a truly astonishing development. And in fact, as you might have guessed, it was actually a little too good to be true. The press release turned out to be a hoax. Okay, and just kind of, this is from Reuters a couple days later when everyone realized what had actually happened. Essentially, the press release had been disseminated through a phony corporate website. It was www.CSR Shell, right? Corporate, CSR, interestingly, right? Comprehensive Shell Remediation, but also corporate social responsibility. So it was kind of a little game that was designed by an activist group calling itself the Nigerian Justice League. The group had apparently trained for this action at a Yes Lab workshop organized by the famed Culture Jam and Yes Men. The Financial Times had just recently refused to run an Amnesty International ad about the Niger Delta. They refused Amnesty's money to run this ad. but inadvertently, as a result of the hoax, ended up addressing it for free by mounting the story about the remediation plan before they discovered that it in fact was a hoax. And that's why it's actually hard to get the remediation plan online. It was scrubbed off the web. It's only available at a couple of sites at this point. In the process, the Nigerian Justice League's web text managed to leverage some moderate amount of corporate shaming. Now, you might call this an act of irony activism. And essentially, this identity-nabbing political prank by ventriloquizing Shell executives worked to comment on the real motives behind corporate remedial action. So Shell essentially is being presented there as protecting its corporate image. But the prank can also be read as an ironized utopian text. It sounds lovely, everything that is going to be achieved. Essentially, what the prank did was it spelled out a politically impossible scenario that would actually have been required in order to achieve the genuine environmental remediation for the Niger Delta region. That kind of costly, laborious redistribution of resources and the restitution of harm would have needed to do, kind of an overwhelming list of things. Shell would have had to walk away from its ongoing exploitation of oil in a region that still supplies a sizable percentage of American oil exports. It would have had to remove 50 years worth of spilled petroleum that saturated the physical environment. It would have had to restore badly contaminated water supplies, restore fish stocks and ways of human life associated with that resource, rebuilt destroyed villages, compensated the Ogoni and other people for the huge number of human victims, and maybe perhaps the most kind of difficult, facilitated a political settlement that would ease the intense conflicts and militarization of the region that's caused by all of the above, all of that damage. So in short, meaningful, positive environmental remediation would have necessitated an utter transformation in the very nature of what Royal Shell, Dutch Shell is and what it does. The hoax also drew attention in the process to several related insights. Once revealed as a prank, the CSRND confirmed that the bad publicity of the BP deepwater spill, and we certainly heard a lot about it, however certain to elicit some kind of remediation effort along the US Gulf Coast, would hardly trigger any response to the environmental damage in sub-Saharan Africa. And here I just refer back to my second slide, the epigraph in which it suggested that remediation, like many other medicines, is primarily provided to people living in environments of the global north. This revelation raises an interesting corollary question that I want to think about for the bulk of this talk, namely, how might the promise of remediation for environmental sites that receive extensive media coverage, such as BP promises to the Gulf, ensure in some fashion the absence of remediation in environments that are largely invisible to the global media, like the Delta? In other words, how might remedial promises made in the so-called First World, the pledge to neutralize the toxicity of an unfortunate oil spill in the Gulf of Mexico, enable its persistence elsewhere? I previously was noting that Jay Bolter and Richard Grusin write about new media with an eye to their frequent recasting of older media, their mimicry of earlier representational forms and semiotic codes that allow the, quote, representation of one medium in another, end quote. Or more particularly, in some circumstances, a new medium's presentation of itself as an improved means of accessing an old one, right? The ebook is more available, just like a book, but you can download it anywhere at any time and anyone can get it. Part of what fascinates me about the CSRND is its sorcerous promise to magically clean water, bring back fish, restore the Ogoni, and roll back half a century of human and natural history's miseries. It's a bit like a Pharmikons in Plato's dialogue and in Derrida's analysis. The Pharmikons is the magician who produces the drug, the filter, the Pharmikon. It conjures up, along with the fantasy of very deep pockets indeed, an entirely new environmental medium, the pristine 21st century Niger Delta, promised by an ethically chastened Royal Dutch Shell. This image, in turn, conjures retroactively the revivified image of an older Delta before Shell had arrived, before the so-called devil's excrement of petroleum had begun to poison everything it touched. Now, the fantasy of the restored delta was to be sure a prank, but it's a prank whose own dissimulation offered an ironic reflection upon the prior dissimulation of Shell's claim to show environmental concern. And in purposely affecting ignorance about the political impossibility of such corporate discourse leading to that kind of remedy, what the CSR-ND did is it playfully anatomized the phantasmagoric work of actually existing environmental remediation. So to stay within the range of petrocultural examples, just to turn back to the Deepwater Horizon spill in the Gulf of Mexico, which did in fact spawn widely publicized remediation efforts. And you'll remember the skimmer ships, the oil booms, the heavy use of chemical dispersants to sink the oil off the visible surfaces of the water, the cleanup crews for the beaches. All of this meant to augur a return to the environment that existed before the spill, as you see in the first slide. Environmental remediation can be redefined as more than anything else a mediated performance of restitution rather than as a remedy. The staging of an obligatory ritual of purification and rejuvenation in a strict sense, to rejuvenate, to kind of restore a former state, a kind of younger state, whose aim is to engender a new environment that in recalling the older one that existed prior to the perpetration of the ecological or the human disaster kind of wins a certain forgiveness for the action. Grusin and Bolter remind us that a new medium does not, in fact, ever recreate the old one that it mimics. The computer image of a painting is not a painting. The e-book is not the print book. It's something new. And this is the case with environmental remediation as well. Dig under the rocks on the beach, one finds petroleum. Look beneath the skin surface of the waters, one finds a markedly different ecosystem than what existed prior. The remediated environment will only appear to have conjured back into existence the old one, and primarily in ways that concern the most relevantly mediated needs. The restored environment is the product of a ritual whose publicity would seem to confirm its status as a norm. Global media attention on the reparative work in Alaska or the Gulf eases suspicion that it would not be happening in places such as Ecuador or Nigeria. What is being remediated exactly, right? This is sort of the question. What is being remediated? In a certain sense, maybe the environment is being remediated to a certain degree. But what is also being remediated is the potential for a psychic wound, a loss of confidence in corporate accountability, a traumatization of trust in the environmental security of the accumulation process that might get in the way of continued woundings of the environment in locales that exist below the radar of global media attention. The form that's taken by the Pharmikon of environmental remediation, I will try to characterize it as neoliberal in a certain vein, can perhaps be most fully grasped by drawing a literal comparison with meds. There's an excellent recent book by Joseph Dummett titled Drugs for Life that I found very useful in thinking about this. And what Dummett does is he explores what he calls a new kind of health that has been developed by contemporary pharmaceutical companies. And what's distinctive to this new kind of health is that it redefines human beings in terms, or the health of human beings in terms of a normality that's no longer characterized by healthiness per se, but instead by a state of chronic health insecurity that can only be addressed through preemptive pharmaceutical intervention, right? So the normal state of affairs is not that I'm well. The normal state of affairs is that I might not be well, and that there's a probability that I might not be well, and that tests must be run in order to ensure that if there is some sense in which I might not be well, that needs an intervention, medical intervention. Blockbuster drugs, a whole new category of pharmaceuticals developed in clinical trials, are designed very differently from older pharmaceuticals, no longer to cure an illness that afflicts some limited population. Instead, they provide proactive, long-term therapeutic treatment of some observable risk factor within a much larger population. In this new medical paradigm, what one seeks to alleviate with drugs is not a current health problem. What would it be, right? What is the illness exactly that I have? What it is, again, is the anticipation of this future one. So, if we ask the question, what exactly does the drug aim to cure right now? What is the actually existing condition? What you're left to conclude is that the only condition that it could possibly address in the here and now is the psychic harm to one's own sense of healthiness that the screening process itself has inflicted. The new drugs, in short, are meant to treat the fears that are generated by the new system of health itself. There's a different way to understand the phenomena, too. I'd like to sort of call attention to this. And that involves a fundamental displacement of the biopolitical target of health in the context, again, of sort of the commercialization and kind of for-profit mechanism of the health industry. From this perspective, it's no longer human health that the system described by Dummett seeks to optimize, but rather the financial health of pharmaceutical companies, a health whose relation to any human population has been abstracted into the economic register of market value. And I'm very intrigued by the way that economics are spoken of through the discourse of health, healthy economies, unhealthy economies, sickly economies, the need for economic remedies. The question that's involved here is no longer the traditional biopolitical one. How do we ensure, right, in sort of the classic era of biopolitics, that we have maximized public health by minimizing the endemic illnesses and injuries suffered by the population? Instead, the question becomes, what relationship of population to the use of pharmaceuticals generates the greatest possible future earnings and thus the greatest productivity and promise of economic health and longevity for the relevant industries, which of course gets understood as a need for generalized kind of economic health. As a certain kind of neo-Derridian Pharmikons that are designed for a neoliberal environment, the drugs of Big Pharma distribute their polyvalence too, but in a different way. They promise remedies to the future uncertainties of an industry's economic health, but in the process they generate a powerful and highly ambiguous medical impact on human bodies, sometimes curative, no doubt, but sometimes toxic, as we know, when people are kind of assigned too many meds that begin to conflict with one another and begin to experience kind of health problems as a result of over-medication. Now, environmental remediation doesn't work in exactly the same way. In the case of oil companies, remediation services are not the primary product. Nevertheless, there is still a sense in which the petroleum industry markets the therapies it has developed in a meaningful financial relationship to its anticipated future earnings. This relationship is explicitly referenced in the words that the CSR&D prank playfully attributed to Shell CEO Peter Voser. And what they had him saying in the prank is, quote, "By anticipating and proactively sidestepping the inevitable storm of company-unfriendly rule changes that follow on major environmental and human calamities of a certain variety, we are building our company's ongoing resilience well into the future." And part of what's so interesting about that is, of course, that the sort of the irony that escapes people for several days. That sounded like a reasonable sort of relationship to the remediation of the Nigerian Gulf. So what's striking and delicious here is that the representation in the CSR&D of a brush with death, to sort of what I was referring to in remediation, you have to have a brush with death before there can be a remediation. That the brush with death is not one for the Niger Delta, the brush with death is for Shell, right, who's risking being harmed by company-unfriendly rule changes. So there's a curative action in which the promised remediation is displaced onto financial health in the Shell case, that recalls Big Pharma's similar pursuit of ongoing resilience well into the future for themselves, right, in that kind of sense. I want to stress that I'm not suggesting that environmental remediation is merely a corporate hoax or that it only causes harm, any more than Dummett, and he's very clear on this. He wants to make sure no one confuses his argument with saying that all prescription drugs are simply poisons that are peddled for profit. Medicine does cure, and it is often necessary, okay? And environmental remediation is often absolutely necessary, and it really can alleviate toxicity. The point is rather that environmental remediation has to be sort of considered through the ambiguous form of the Pharmikon, that it must be sort of observed to also function as a filter, as a drug, that is designed to counteract the economic risks faced by corporations in priority over the ecological disasters that they have perpetrated. And indeed, it's by the very absence of anything better than a hoax to treat the Nigerian case that we know that only a health risk to corporate well-being actually triggers these remedial actions. For the same reason, the remedial action takes the form of a mediation. It stages the making of the new environment as a certain kind of simulation of what precedes it in order to erase the disaster that threatens the life of the corporation in that sense. So there's an interesting kind of issue here about erasure that needs to be kind of brought in. So the second part of this paper is called Pharmaco Criticism. And I'm going to shift here registers from a kind of discursive analysis of the politics of environmental health to a more kind of literary politics of environmental health. In some of my earlier work, and I know some of you have looked at it, I've criticized the modes of eco-criticism that engage ecological crisis as the pernicious consequence of an anthropocentric human-non-human binary. And the problem with attributing environmental crisis to the human-non-human binary, to insisting on that line and devaluing, if you like, the non-human, is that while that actually does happen and can operate that way, it's also that to describe what the source of environmental crisis in those terms is to remain oblivious to third terms that conduct the flow of power between the human and the non-human realm. And here we could refer to neocolonial domination, we could refer to kind of racial categorization, or we could refer to economic value. There are many third terms that intervene. Such forms of eco-criticism that insist on binarizing can't draw any meaningful distinction between the different kinds of geopolitics within which literary representations of environments and people might be embedded. It becomes difficult, for example, to discern why an apparently biocentric discourse, that's a term that you find in environmental discourse, biocentric is sort of, from the point of view of the earth, from the point of view of life, that you express concern for the earth in one setting, perhaps in the Gulf of Mexico, and yet that biocentric language might paradoxically help to poison the environment in a different setting. Or why an apparently anthropocentric discourse, the assertion that people just need oil, right, seems to be sort of putting people on the side of benefiting from what is about to transpire, actually turns out to inflict tremendous harm on people, such as the decimation of indigenous peoples or ethnic micro-minorities. It's a much more complicated kind of triangulation. Literature, and for that matter, literary criticism may, of course, themselves serve as third terms that mediate the human-non-human relation. And in such a context, eco-criticism might best be described as a mode of critical analysis that reflects upon the relationship between literary representations of environments and the populations that might inhabit those environments and the readerships that might engage those representations. That's really what eco-criticism tries to address. If there's a political question that's animating all those reflections, it would seem to be something like whether and how the relationship of readers to those environments and populations, or more abstractly to environmental and population issues per se, might be transformed in some fashion by the literary encounter. Eco-criticism's treatment of literature as a third term, a mediator, standing between the human and the non-human, also therefore becomes susceptible to the pharmacoanalysis that I've been outlining in this talk. Particularly, for example, in its early love affair with American nature writing, eco-criticism has sometimes viewed literature as a remedy for ecological crisis, right? To read about nature is to come to love nature, and it helps to mediate our relationship to the value of nature, to assist us to remedy sort of perhaps a kind of an inadequate valuing, or it may bring us to an awareness of an impending crisis, which could also be kind of equally valuable. Conversely, when literature seems to recapitulate ideologies of human mastery over nature, eco-criticism has approached literature as a source of environmental toxin, right? That's the problem with our language, ultimately, that is poisoning our relationship to the environment. Eco-criticism, if it can take up a rigorously comparative approach, an approach that's sensitive to the differential circulation of power, could be positioned very adequately to discern not just the two-sidedness of literature's mediation of the environment. Does it sort of ask us to love the environment or to despise or not care about the environment? but ultimately its own two-sidedness, its pharmaco-critical work as an environmental discourse with the potential to harm as well as to help. So under what conditions, I would want eco-criticism to ask itself, might the mediating role even of a literature or criticism that nominally values nature worsen a situation, a condition of environmental toxicity? To offer an example of the dynamic I'm trying to talk about, we could reflect on the history of modern nature writing in the global north with its proximity to the political project of wilderness preservation as an antidote to metropolitan urbanization. We might ask to what extent does that project and the embrace of nature there become linked through a geopolitical frame to the invisibility of what Rob Nixon has astutely called the slow violence that's perpetrated against populations and environments of the global south. To what extent must metropolitan nature writing, in other words, be read in a global context, not necessarily of its own fault, but just that we have to understand the context in which it's operating, read it as a genre that's imbricated in the uneven degradations of carbon capitalism. Or to offer a completely different example, when might naturalistic literary depictions of life under degraded environmental conditions in the global south, a subject that's so often taken up in what Lawrence Beale calls second wave eco-criticism, risk naturalizing those very conditions to readers in the global life? Such questions would necessarily concern both the what of literature's mapping function, right, which environments are represented, which are valued, which are not, but also the how. What are the possible signifying effects of the representational strategies that are employed? Such a pharmaco-criticism, a fully self-aware one, would take pains to consider when and how the valorization of nature has differentially and tightly related geopolitical effects that are potentially themselves kind of destructive of that which they purport to want to prevent. And it would also be important to consider the work of multi-level discursive, such as the one used by the CSRND itself, where the rhetoric of concern for nature only gains its political efficacy when you realize that it's operating ironically, right? Very important there. When it's rendering the language of cure legible as a tactical maneuver, you begin to understand the tactics of different language in the discourse of nature. So I'd like to turn to a text, because I am an English professor, by Hilal Kabila. He published this novel, Oil on Water, in 2010. It's a novel that is in sharp contrast to the ironized utopian aesthetic found in the CSRND. It adopts instead a testimonial approach to the conditions of petroviolence in the Nigerian Delta. And I just, sometimes literature, as you unpack it, is sort of helpful in picking up the multivalences and sort of understanding the stakes of the tactics. So I'm using the literature, the novel here heuristically in that kind of way. Habila's novel tells the story of Rufus, a young Nigerian journalist who is sent by his newspaper to join Zach, an older journalist he once idealized, so that they can engage in a search for the kidnapped wife of a petroleum engineer. The guerrilla group that has kidnapped her is led by a mysterious man known as the Professor. This is perhaps an apt nom de guerre insofar as he professes to be a spokesperson for the people. And he says, everything we do is for the people. So he professes, yes? It's the Professor who speaks the novel's titular phrase. He says, write only the truth to Rufus near the end of the book. Quote, tell them about the flares you see at night and the oil on the water and the soldiers forcing us to escalate the violence every day. Tell them how we are hounded in our own land. This is the truth. Remember that. You can go. End quote. The novel could be read for an espousal of environmental heroism. It could be analyzed, in other words, from the ideological point of view of the Professor himself, who claims to symbolize and defend a deep unity between the long-suffering land and the people. And such a reading, in order to achieve that reading, you would need to perform a very neat series of equivalences and alignments.